At the end of the previous lesson, we noted that John Stuart Mill would disagree to a certain extent with that of John Locke relating to the concept of liberalism and representative democracy and representative government. And this does beg the question as to whether or not liberalism may be compatible with a conception of democracy, which is what we're going to do in this lesson. We're going to talk about this conception in more detail. We'll talk about the arguments for liberalism being compatible with democracy and then arguments against it. So, examining issues pertaining to liberalism and democracy, of course, means examining a number of different political positions in this area. This does relate to the concept of classical liberalism, and so as a result of which we're going to try and focus as much as possible on some of the ideas within classical liberalism, rather than straying too far into more modern liberal ideas, which is, of course, the topic of the next lesson. So, first question, and the first thing that we should note is that democracy is something that we have studied before. Anybody who is studying political ideas will have already come across what we mean when we talk about democracy. The idea of democracy comes from the Greek demokratia, which of course refers to the power of the people. And it therefore means that democracy is a system of government whereby the people have authority and power over the government itself by way often of the use of elections that are open to the broader electorate, the people themselves. Now, one of the things that is notable when it comes to the ways in which liberalism interacts with this conception is that John Locke, of course one of the founding fathers of liberalism, argued that government should represent only that of property-owning men. Now, this is a system of representative government. Yes, this is a system to an extent of democracy in the sense that people have power over government, i.e. property-owning men, but it is a very limited conception of democracy because property-owning men, especially in the 16th and 1700s when John Locke was writing, is of course a very limited number of people. It does not include women, obviously. It does not include people who don't own property. So the vast majority of people under which the government should control would not have a say and any kind of authority over the government itself. Mill would also challenge Locke's view that the representative government could potentially lead to a tyranny of the majority, i.e. whereby you have a majority of people who believe one thing and a minority of people who believe a different thing. Could the majority vote to impose restrictions on the liberty and rights of the minority? So this is obviously the question as to whether or not liberalism could be compatible with the concept of democracy. Let's think about the first side of this argument, the view that liberalism actually is compatible with democracy. Well, there are a number of different ways in which we can make this claim. On the one hand, we could argue that democracy increases a person's individualism. This is because individuals can vote for who they want, and therefore make a rational choice in coming to that decision. When you're in the voting booth, you do not have an obligation to tell anybody who you voted for and to explain even why you voted for that person. There is, or that in a good liberal democracy, there should be no coercion over who you vote for within a particular election, and so as a result of which you have the ability to make a rational and individual choice in who you want to represent you within government. If there are regular, free and fair elections, this can create a system of government by consent. Now, the importance here is, of course, regular, free and fair. Fair elections, of course, means that there is the opportunity for anybody who is running for election to win the election, as well as for anybody who wants to vote in the election who is above a certain, meets a certain threshold to vote in the election. So in the United Kingdom, for example, you cannot be somebody who is in prison, you cannot be somebody who is under the age of 18. There are certain restrictions related to individuals who may be seeking asylum, I think. But for the most part, if you are an adult who is therefore over the age of 18, you do not currently live at Her Majesty's pleasure in a prison, you have the ability to vote in your elections. Elections should also be free. There should not be some kind of financial capacity that is linked to your ability to make a vote. If there is this idea of, for example, owning property, well, I don't own property. I don't own land, a house, or a mortgage in that kind of way. So as a result of that, would I therefore be limited in my ability to actually have an election? To vote in an election, do I have to have a certain amount of money? Do I have to do I have to show my bank account before I go and cast a vote? These could all be things that would place a limitation on the concept of democracy. But if you have regular, fair and free elections, this does automatically create a system of government by consent, because the people are therefore consenting by casting a vote to whoever is going to be elected. And also there is this sort of implicit acceptance that when you go to vote for somebody, you accept if that person does not get into office. So I went, for example, just speaking from past experience, in the 2019 election, I went and I voted for the Labour Party. However, the Conservatives ultimately won, and they won with quite a significant majority. Now, implicit in my vote for the Labour Party was the acceptance that if Labour do not get in, and they didn't in my constituency, then that doesn't matter. Then I accept that is the case, because that is the will of the people, that is the will of the majority of the people. And therefore I would therefore consent to the Conservative government that took office, regardless of how I feel about it. So ultimately, all of these things contribute to the idea of government by way of consent. Democracy can limit state power by being held accountable to the electorate, and so therefore represents the concept of limited government, which is of course also critical for classical liberals. So you have this idea of limiting government because you are accountable to the electorate by way of elections. If you do something that is so incredibly unpopular, like if you were Margaret Thatcher and you introduced a poll tax in the late 1980s, then you are going to have to be subjected to the protests and the attacks on yourself by other members of the party. And subsequently and ultimately, you would have been held accountable by the people at the next election. So as a result of which, you are limited in your decision to make these choices. On the other hand, you also have this idea that liberalism may not be compatible with democracy. Mill once argued that a liberal representative system can lead to this tyranny of the majority. Let's unpack this in a little bit more detail. The idea that if you are a majority of people, you can therefore have the will to oppress that of a minority. There have been plenty of examples of what can be considered to be liberal democracies, which actually ultimately, because of the majority being voted in, end up collapsing democracy and oppressing minorities owing to the tyranny of the majority. At the same time as making these lessons, we're also recording lessons for the A-level history module, which is titled Democracy and Nazism, which essentially traces the fall of liberal democracy within Weimar Germany and the establishment of the Nazi state and the growth of the Nazis. The Nazis, for those who don't know, established authority within the German state through elections. At least initially they did, and then as soon as Hitler managed to become chancellor and take power, they worked on destroying the institutions from within and essentially destroying democracy from within and establishing a dictatorship. This could happen in a liberal representative system. It did happen in a liberal representative system. As we already know, Locke argued that government should represent only property-owning men. So one of the things that you could question is, well, what do classical liberals actually define as democracy? I would define democracy as an individual, as a right to vote for everybody. Even to this day, I would argue that, for example, people who are in prison should have the right to vote, as per the European Convention on Human Rights as well. But Locke would disagree with me if he was here today. He would say, well, no, only those who own property and who are men should be able to vote. As a result of which, as somebody who doesn't own property, I would not be allowed to vote within Locke's conception. This obviously reduces what is known as the franchise and therefore decreases this concept of democracy. And you could also make the argument that a representative liberal state is subject to the same problems as a representative democracy. So the idea of representation by individuals and the delineation between direct democracy and representative democracy, something that you will have studied when you did democracy and participation for UK politics earlier on in the year.